You've become quite an extraordinary icon of hope. Is that a burden?
Yes, if people base their hopes on you, then of course it's a responsibility.
A housewife from Oxford, mother of 2 British boys, Aung San Suu Kyi, now aged 79, is today the world's most famous female political prisoner. And for 6 short years, she was the leader of the world's youngest democracy.
Here was a woman leader who was principled and honourable and iconic, stepping into the role of her father, wanting a democracy in her country.
Caught between her safety in the West and imprisonment in her mother country, she sacrificed her freedom.
I don't really believe in fate. I think you choose to do what you do, and you reap the fruits of your deeds.
Targeting and killing the Rohingya Muslim minority, UN experts say Myanmar's army acted with genocidal intent.
Well, let's get over to The Hague live in the Netherlands. Anna Holligan is at the court following what has been a remarkable hour or 2 of testimony.
She suffered the greatest fall from grace. A woman the world rejected. A woman cancelled.
Will you say sorry? Why won't you speak to us?
Myanmar, 2024. A country all but cut off from the outside world. In a prison cell near the new capital, Naypyidaw, a 79-year-old woman who spent 30 years fighting a brutal military dictatorship is locked up in a prison, facing a further 27 years behind bars. This is Aung San Suu Kyi, a controversial figure, but just 10 years ago, a woman celebrated around the world.
I spoke with my mum just before the coup, so that was just over 3.5 years ago or thereabouts.
Today, Kim Aris, her youngest son, battles for the freedom of his mother, as well as to wrest Myanmar from military dictatorship.
That would be me, my brother, and our grandfather. I mean, I've always been very proud of my mum. It can be difficult at times, but it's, something that I'm certainly proud of. What's been done to my mother is just an extension of what's been done to the people of Burma, so the two go hand in hand. Well, that's my grandfather, General Aung San of Burma. He's not someone I've ever met, unfortunately, and my mother was 3 years old when he was assassinated, so she didn't get to spend much time with him.
General Aung San was this brilliant mercurial figure who fought alongside the Japanese initially inside Burma, trying to wrest it from the control of the British, and then switched sides towards the end of World War II to the British side.
I have come to London in response to the invitation of His Majesty's government in order to discuss the constitutional questions of Burma. The demand of our people is complete independence.
And became seen by them as the most trustworthy and powerful figure in the Burmese fight for independence. But in 1947 he was, and most of his closest colleagues were slaughtered by a political rival while they were having a meeting in the middle of Rangoon. Suu Kyi was a small child, the youngest of his children when this happened, and she came to have a powerful sense that it was her destiny to do what he had been unable to do because he died.
This is also a family tragedy. Suu Kyi watching as the military seized power in the first of several coups long after her father had brought democracy and independence to Myanmar in 1962. The young Suu Kyi moved to Oxford, where she studied politics, philosophy and economics at St Hugh's College. Kim meets with one of his mother's university friends to discover how the city that was once their home shaped her life.
And this was in St Hugh's?
This is at St Hugh's, and that's Sue, absolutely characteristic, brave, uncompromising, looking straight at the camera, lots of strength of character. And I had a terrific time with her as undergraduates at St Hugh's. We had a lovely group of friends, lots of international figures. So the first thing I remember about my friendship with Sue was that she taught me all about Burma, her pride in her father.
After finishing her education, Suu Kyi married Michael Eris, a British historian who studied Tibetan, and settled together as a family in the city of Dreaming Spires.
My initial impression of her was, of course, that a great beauty, very nice, very unpretentious, shopped in the market in Gloucester Green, cycled back with her handlebars covered in heavy bags full of groceries, a woman having children with the usual kind of problems that young mothers have, and somehow dead straight. I would say that her integrity and her feeling for truth was apparent in the smallest things that she did.
This life was upended in 1988 with the news that her mother was fatally ill in Myanmar following a stroke.
Once she had left, did you have any sense that this was going to be for a long time?
Not at first. At first we thought it would be temporary, just while she went back to look after her mother. But obviously when she got caught up in politics, we realised that it could be some time.
During the months that she was by her mother's bedside in Rangoon, there was an uprising of students and workers against the regime, and for the first time since the army had taken over in 1962, their power was challenged by an uprising. And because Suu Kyi was the daughter of General Aung San, she was besieged by people in the opposition movement asking her, look, come and help us, please, you would make a difference. She resisted. She had 2 children, she was a dedicated mother, but in the end she was persuaded, and she and other prominent people in the opposition formed the National League for Democracy.
Was there a stage at which you realised that she would go back to Burma, or was it only when she stayed out there that?
No, it was clear from the beginning of my friendship with her that this was the most important thing in her life, the country.
Yeah. She always told my father she would go back if the country needed her.
It was an agreement between them that he would accommodate that, he would encourage it, he would help her. Yeah.
Well, he certainly fulfilled that.
Yes, that huge debt.
That August, Suu Kyi made her first public speech in front of a crowd of 150,000 people demanding democracy in her home country.
It was the moment that the tide turned, and you could see this huge mass of an audience of thousands all listening, and the whole country behind her in her movement towards democracy. She was the prow of the boat that was going to take them into a democratic state, was what I thought that this symbolic occasion was, and certainly I think that's how it's remembered by the people in Myanmar.
Have you considered, and I'm sure you have, why they regard you as such a potent threat?
Because I have the support of the people. The people are not afraid of me. And because they're not afraid of me, they tell me what they think.
Very soon she became the symbol. She's not a glamorous figure, she wasn't a glamorous figure, but she was a figure who conveyed a serene beauty, I think, in terms of the iconography, which was very, very effective. And I think they found it difficult to deal with a woman.
In 1990, the military junta held free elections for the first time in almost 30 years, with Suu Kyi's NLD party winning. But the military junta refused to cede power. Aung San Suu Kyi was placed under house arrest for the first time. The start of being captive over more than 3 decades.
I was actually with her when she was first put under house arrest. I realised what was happening even though I was very young. A number of trucks took away the students, set up a perimeter around the house along with barbed wire and guards, cut off the phone lines. This may have been just before my mother was put under house arrest, or perhaps slightly afterwards, I'm not sure. Maybe when my brother and my father came to join us after she was put under house arrest. I would have been about 12 back then. No date on this. And this will be the Nobel Peace Prize. So my brother gave the acceptance speech there.
I stand before you here today to accept, on behalf of my mother, Aung San Suu Kyi, this greatest of prizes, the Nobel Prize for Peace.
In recognition of her struggle for her country's freedom, Aung San Suu Kyi was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace, as she became an important symbol in the struggle against oppression. Freedom denied her by the military junta.
Theirs is the prize, and theirs will be the eventual victory in Burma's long struggle for peace, freedom, and democracy.
Although it's nearly 3 years since I was last allowed to see my wife by the military rulers of Burma, and it's now many months since I could speak to her on the telephone, last year she was able to ask me to represent her here today. She wants me to convey to you now, as clearly as I can, her sincerest thanks for this public recognition of the justice of her cause.
We need maximum attention on what is happening to the National League for Democracy.
For 15 of the next 20 years, Suu Kyi served various forms of house arrest, while her husband Michael continued to campaign in the West. Michael is diagnosed with terminal cancer and given months to live. Sue faced the first of many impossible choices: leaving Burma to be with her family, knowing that she would be barred from re-entering the country, or stay to fight on her own for her people.
I would have, in your place, felt when Sue had the choice of coming back to England when your father was dying and never returning to Burma, or staying there relatively powerless, but at her post. I would have thought that is a very simple decision. It's not difficult, it's painful, and I'm behind her in it. Did you feel that?
Well, it was one of the hardest points in my life, probably, having to see my father go downhill so rapidly.
Yes.
And knowing that really she didn't have a choice in that. After having sacrificed so much already, he certainly didn't want her to be coming back for him at that point.
In 1999, Michael died. In the 10 years following her first arrest, Michael had only seen her 5 times.
92-year-old mother to a light, the democracy people call her here. She's at the gate of her house, waving to them, cheering. The crowd is pushing thousands of Burmese people out on the street. They've been patiently waiting outside party headquarters for hours, but now they've heard that Aung San Suu Kyi has been released.
There was a wonderful moment of transition where we all felt that democracy was burgeoning and that the military junta, which was what it was, I mean, there was a military regime, it was making concessions, and she was being allowed at last to have the freedom of movement. There were going to be elections and she was wanting to stand to become the leader in her country, and so there was a great excitement at that moment.
I was there in 2015 during the whole election campaign. We followed her around everywhere. I was there the night they won, standing outside NLD, their party headquarters, with people were just jubilant. And so I think in terms of like stakes for world democracy, it was almost shocking that Myanmar had made this like turnaround to seemingly become this sort of human rights respecting democracy. It's hard to kind of recapture now because of everything that's happened since, but you really felt how optimistic and positive and exciting things were.
I think there was a great deal of attention on what was happening over there. After all, Burma was the world's youngest democracy, and that was a significant thing, and it still is. And the fact that it had achieved that without too much bloodshed was also very significant.
The West celebrated the new frontier of democracy, and Suu Kyi had their icon of freedom. In Myanmar, laws were concocted which made it impossible for her specifically to be the leader of her country. The Orwellian tactic of a dictatorship was used to make power impossible for her to exercise, while in theory she was named as leader. But realpolitik rarely has time for icons.
For much of that first term of Daw Sue's government, the feeling was electric. We were creating a new country, and the enthusiasm would just bubble up, within everyone in the government. I was hoping to use economic reform as the basis to assist the political transition. So I'm an economist, but a firm believer that economic conditions are often foundational to the politics of a particular country. So I went there to help out with friends of mine who had become the economic reformers in her government, just to try to change the circumstances, the material circumstances of the country, if you like, and just embed democracy that bit better.
I mean, there's an argument that her approach to government was naive. She would go into meetings, again, with an Indian delegation, for example, of 20 people from the Indian Foreign Ministry, and it would be Aung San Suu Kyi and her best friend on the other side of the desk. And there was a sort of amateurism about her approach to government, which didn't help her, really. Possibly a reflection of her fantastic self-confidence.
She was a hugely complex personality. So when she was speaking English to English speakers, she could come across as very, very English, very Oxford actually. I came to believe, and I still believe, that there's something profoundly Burmese and Burman about us. And I think she's very conscious of being her father's daughter and carrying on her father's task.
I was 2 when he died, and later I did research on his life because I wanted to know more. I wanted to know what he was like.
Do you regard him as a hero?
Yes, I do.
Do you think you've inherited any of that from your father?
Well, I think my father, like me, was not born courageous. He has said, and other people have said, that when he was quite little, he was also frightened of the dark. He was frightened of ghosts and things like that, and so was I. So I feel very close to him because I feel that, like him, I had to struggle to overcome my weaknesses.
That sense of being Burmese, of being Burman, and of being heir to Burmese history through your father I think was very profound. I think people often underestimate and misunderstand the specifically Burmese qualities.
She's incredibly smart, and she uses her intelligence in every aspect of her work, but particularly politics. I think she's a good reader of people as well, and which is helpful in a politician.
The person I visited in, it must have been 2012, the beginning of 2012, was a person of, an inspirational person of great principle. It shone through what strong principles she had, how unyielding she was, that she'd spent so long under house arrest, and most people would have given up in that time, but she didn't give up.
She was conscious of her own dignity, which is an important thing in Burmese culture. So it was all done not in a sort of slapdash way, but in a very measured way, the way she spoke to people, whether she was speaking English or especially when she was speaking in Burmese. And people loved her for it. There was, I think, with all the support the NLD has had over the years, a lot of that is a product of the affection that ordinary Burmese feel for Suu, because she expresses something not just about herself, but about the country and about them. I think that's very important. She was reflecting back to them a sense of what it was to be Burmese.
I think dealing with the deep state, and I know that's a controversial expression these days, but I think it's actually very real in Myanmar, as represented by the military and all the organs of state. So dealing with them, trying to bring about change in, say, a civil service, for instance, that have been grown up over the decades to serve a military state, dealing with that, trying to get reform through that sort of system was just incredibly difficult. She was held up as this democracy icon and all that, but interestingly enough, as a person, she never wanted that sort of adulation. And she said to me, as she did to many other people, look, I'm a politician. I have to make compromises. I've got to do the best I can by the country, but I am not this sort of iconic figure that many people have built me up to be. Now, admittedly, at times she was able to use that to her advantage, but boy did it become her disadvantage later when the sort of cancel culture first emerged with respect to hers.
The context of her position in power, in government, she actually had very limited power because of the constitution that the military had written in 2008, which first of all disbarred her from actually being president because there was a clause that said that the president couldn't be married to a foreigner, and obviously that was designed for her. The military also controlled under the constitution several key ministries, the Ministry of Home Affairs, Defence and Border Affairs. They controlled the military's budget, and they also had a proportion of seats in the parliament specifically reserved for the military.
Becoming a politician ties your hands in many ways. I think a lot of people's expectations of what she should have been able to do straight away were quite unrealistic, really.
I mean, there was a feeling among some people that the NLD government, and Suu in particular, should try and move faster to dismantle the power of the military. This is a really, really difficult thing to do.
She was still seeing it as a negotiation where she was trying to, tease it towards a much more democratic form of government. But there was no doubt as to who was in control, and I think she saw that if she wasn't to some extent colluding with them, that she was likely to lose any kind of position at all.
Suu's father had been the great hero of Burmese independence, a great military hero. And of course her senior advisors were almost all former generals. But the fact that she was her father's daughter, and he was the founder, essentially the founder or the joint founder of the Burmese army, the modern Burmese army. For Suu, it also demonstrated in the NLD that the NLD was not itself anti-military. And this is something that Suu herself said to me repeatedly. We're not against the military, we want a strong military. Which meant that they could let the NLD have some say in certain aspects of domestic policy, but on the soft side. The key hard defence, national security decisions and the key decisions about the role of the army in politics would be reserved to the army, and they thought that would do the trick. And Suu agreed to this, and which is why she then becomes a political figure. Looking back, whether the military intended it or not, that was part of the trap they then set for her.
Myanmar has begun to blossom since the end of outright army rule in 2016. In 2011, rather, the government has since opened the country to international investment and launched sweeping reforms.
While the military junta presented a willingness to help democratic reform in Myanmar, in parts of the country, they were cracking down harder than ever on any dissent. The most visible victims were the Muslim Rohingya.
The military, with whom she was obliged to share power, that was the deal, embarked on a very vicious campaign to suppress dissidents in Arakan state, which is to the far west side of Burma, abutting Bangladesh. It's always been a place where there's a lot of turmoil. It has a very mixed population of Muslims and Buddhists. And the Muslim population is essentially called Rohingya, and the Burmese state has for a long time denied their right to citizenship.
The military are interesting on this in that these are not sophisticated people in the ways of the world at all, but there's a certain rat cunning amongst the senior military leadership and a deep understanding, I think, of some of the pressure points of Burmese society, so that they were able to use some inherent racism against Rohingya and some of the other minorities as well, to deliver a certain degree of support for what they were doing.
Gunshots pepper the air at the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh. Witnesses say it's the sound of Rohingya civilians being fired upon by Myanmar's military.
The Associated Press news agency has released a video. It says confirms reports of a massacre of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar.
What was happening to the Rohingya, the Muslim population of Myanmar, was shocking, and more stories were coming out about mass killings, the destruction of villages and firing, burning of them, the mass rape of women, and we were hearing more and more evidence of this. And so there was a great deal of alarm, and we were very concerned that this was happening while she was in partnership with the military.
I would have meetings with her every couple of weeks. We would mostly talk about economics, but of course issues like the Rohingya and so on would come up. And I know absolutely for certain that she was horrified beyond measure of what was happening, and sought desperately ways to try and bring it to an end.
But the issue for me was always, would Suu have authorised a pogrom against the Rohingya? No, she would not. She wouldn't have launched a pogrom, and she was not responsible for this. It was the army that did it. The issue then became, is Suu going to condemn this?
It's very, very difficult to bring a case of genocide before the International Court of Justice. I mean, the thresholds are very, very high. Genocide really has to be about the extermination of a people.
When I heard she was actually going, I thought I'd misread the sentence. I thought I'd misread their statement.
To everyone's amazement, she didn't do this just through lawyers. She turned up herself to be an advocate before that court, the International Court of Justice.
You couldn't say with a straight face anymore that she was doing some complicated game or playing some game behind the scenes. No, she was their main defender at The Hague.
Mr. President, it cannot be ruled out that disproportionate force was used by members of the defense services in some cases in disregard of international humanitarian law, or that they did not distinguish clearly enough between ARSA fighters and civilians. There may also have been failures to prevent civilians from looting or destroying property after fighting or in abandoned villages. But these are determinations to be made in the due course of the criminal justice process, not by any individual in the Myanmar government. Please bear in mind this complex situation and the challenge to sovereignty and security in our country when you are assessing the intent of those who attempted to deal with the rebellion. Surely, under the circumstances, genocidal intent cannot be the only hypothesis.
It felt like the embodiment of all the little betrayals that had happened up to that point, because those other things had been in isolated incidents or in just maybe not saying something when she could have spoken up or things like that. But you know, here is it's in the flesh. You know, it's in a room. It's in that grand hall of justice, and it's Aung San Suu Kyi denying what happened. You know, playing down, watering down like crimes against humanity. It's shocking.
So she was being asked to put herself in a position of direct opposition to the military, something which was very popular among segments of the Burmese population, knowing that whatever she said would not have an impact on the military's behaviour in Rakhine.
I think my mother was painted in such a light over the Rohingya situation, in that people thought that she was ignoring the plight of this Muslim minority in Burma, which wasn't the case at all. She was doing everything in her power to try and rectify the situation. And her chief advisor at the time was a Rakhine Muslim who was assassinated with his grandchild in his arms at Rangoon airport. A lot of these things are largely ignored, if not completely ignored, and everything that she was doing is not talked about. What is talked about is what she was not saying. And people wanted her to say things which, quite frankly, wouldn't have helped the situation at all. It would have only antagonized the military and made the situation worse for everybody.
After Aung San Suu Kyi spoke at The Hague, many of those who had previously lauded her for championing democracy began to distance themselves. A serious blow to her credibility came when human rights group Amnesty International withdrew their Ambassador of Conscience award, something they had never done before or since.
The Ambassador of Conscience is the highest amnesty honor, and it's meant to inspire people to protect human rights, to support human rights, and to inspire others to take action for human rights change. And when it was awarded to Aung San Suu Kyi, she was still under house arrest, I believe, and she, at the time, really represented the hopes of Myanmar. There's no denying that. Her position on the Rohingya and the crackdown that was happening, which was led by the Myanmar military, was almost the opposite of that. She was becoming an apologist for human rights abusers. She was becoming a shield for the Myanmar military. And it would be almost impossible or untenable to have that kind of person be Amnesty's Ambassador of Conscience. It wouldn't make any sense. It would make a mockery of the award itself in the very term.
The view grew in the West that Suu Kyi had left her principles behind by siding with the junta. But her actions elsewhere suggest it was a far more complicated path she was trying to tread.
Well, I think we should certainly be careful to look at some of the things she did actually do in response to the Rohingya crisis. For example, she set up the Kofi Annan Commission to try to find solutions to the appalling situation in Rakhine State. And that's often overlooked by her critics. And we should remember that. And of course, the Kofi Annan report came out offering some really credible ways forward. And then the whole situation with the Rohingyas escalated almost immediately. So I think there are things she did that we should remember and give her credit for. But as I say, she made mistakes, not least defending the military in The Hague.
I think that it's all too easy for us to have expectations which are too high, and the reality of dealing with those things on the ground is very difficult indeed. And what came through to some extent in her advocacy was a sense that, I mean, she was defending, and she has always defended, the legacy that she felt her family had, and that she had because of her father, who was the great man of Burma, and he was the person who created this army. Somewhere in her being there is this business about preserving his legacy, but there's also a nationalism that isn't the sort of modern nationalism. We all feel a sense of national pride about the places we come from, but what we relish nowadays is civic nationalism, a nationalism that embraces minorities and new arrivals, new immigrants and peoples who live within your society who may not be part of the mainstream. And that didn't happen in Burma.
At the time when the Rohingya were at their lowest, like being killed in the thousands, being raped, having their houses burned down, she didn't say anything in support. She didn't rise to their defense.
I know people have said that maybe my mother made some mistakes, and perhaps she did, but I don't think that there were that many options to her. The way she was trying to do things was the least likely to result in the bloodshed that has now happened. And I think, obviously, over the Rohingya situation, my mother's name was no longer, the shining beacon that it once was.
What people internationally were saying, I'm sure they think would have counted as progressive. But actually, if you want to have an impact, you have to make sure that that the NLD, and Suu in particular, survive in government. And that's the thing that was at risk. The alternative to Suu wasn't a sudden outbreak of democratic feeling among the military. It was another military coup. It was always another military coup. And I think the fact that her friends internationally and other supporters internationally then drained away because of this was a key factor in the military's decision to launch the coup in 2021, because they thought they had Suu where they wanted her. Because her big asset was always the international support she commanded. If she doesn't command us any longer, we can ignore her. We can overthrow her. So, I think it was actually a disgrace. And this is not, the attacks on the Rohingya, the massacres of the Rohingya, the pogroms, were themselves a disgrace. But the way you deal with this is not to destroy the one democratic hope that Burma has, in my opinion.
I think what she was trying to do was to make the military indebted to her and to give her and the civilian government more broadly a certain leverage over the military. I think that was a miscalculation, because I think the military were never going to allow any sort of leverage over their activities, and of course later events demonstrated precisely that. But yeah, so my own view is that it was well-intentioned, but a well-intentioned political miscalculation.
With her reputation on the international stage left in tatters, the general saw a chance to remove her party, the NLD, from any power. While the world sat in COVID quarantine, the generals launched another coup.
The day I was arrested was the 6th of February, 5 days after the coup itself. I was aware even before I was arrested that Aung San Suu Kyi and all the other ministers had been arrested. In fact, most of them had been picked up on the very first day of the coup. I've been in a hotel in Yangon, quarantined because of COVID. I get an email from somebody saying that they were a staff member of the hotel, saying to me that the military had taken over the hotel, that it was time to get out. I was taken to a local police station for the first few hours, put in this dreadful cell, which unfortunately was sort of the preface for all the cells that would follow, in that it was, decrepit and filthy and rat infested and just about everything you can imagine that would horrify one about a cell. So I was taken to this police station, held there for a few hours. Then I was ultimately taken to the headquarters of the Special Investigation Unit, where I was put into this basically square box, where I was then held for the next 2 months and underwent interrogation in that room. A little bit of ill treatment, not the sort of torture that my Burmese colleagues had meted out to them, but severe ill treatment anyway. At one point they tried to set my hair on fire, and other points was, punched and things like that. But I never got the full measure that my Burmese colleagues did, which was to have electrodes attached to them and to be very severely beaten or anything like that. I think throughout that period I feared for my life. I didn't really fear that they would kill me because I thought that the repercussions of that would be too severe even for them. But what I did fear was that the anxiety, the ill treatment, the incredible heat, because this room, this box was not air conditioned, of course, and Rangoon is a very, very hot place. So I actually feared that my body would fail me. I was 57 at the time. I feared I might just have a heart attack.
Now, Myanmar's deposed leader Aung San Suu Kyi and her Australian economic advisor Sean Turnell have been charged with violating the country's Official Secrets Act. The charges come almost 8 weeks after the military seized power in a coup and as the junta continues a violent crackdown on opponents to the new regime.
When the military staged a coup in February, it cited electoral fraud as its justification. Leader Aung San Suu Kyi and other top officials were detained and charged with offences ranging from breaching coronavirus rules to corruption. Now, nearly 10 months after the coup, the junta has added election fraud to the list. Many analysts say the junta's intention is to ensure she stays out of politics.
I think if the military decides to release her, drop the charges, or suspend the sentence, or whatever distortion of the legal system they decide to do, it will be with assurances that she won't play a role in politics in Myanmar in the future.
The last day I saw Aung San Suu Kyi was the final day of our trial, the day of conviction. And of course, being Myanmar under the military, there was no doubt that we would be convicted. As soon as we were charged, we knew a year later we would be found guilty, and that's exactly what happened. So that's the last day I saw her.
The former leader of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, who was ousted from power in a military coup earlier this year, has been sentenced to 4 years in prison. A spokesman for the military-backed government said she was found guilty of inciting unrest and violating COVID restrictions during last year's election campaign. It's the first in a series of verdicts she's facing that could see her be sent to prison for the rest of her life.
The prison cells that political prisoners are held in Myanmar are rudimentary, if not just plain terrible, quite frankly. They're usually built of concrete, with no distinguishing features inside. They're usually painted white. The cells are completely open. Apart from the weather, they're completely open to other elements such as rats and spiders and centipedes and these awful black tarantulas. Political prisoners in Myanmar are held in their cells throughout the day. There's usually only 2 periods in the day that they're allowed out. So the cells are not conducive of any sort of comfort at all. They're really little more than animal pens.
After 650 days behind bars, Australian professor Sean Turnell has been freed from a Myanmar prison.
All of it does take a toll. The physical deprivation, the constant anxiety, the fear, the incredible insecurity of not knowing when or if you're going to be released definitely takes a toll on you, and I think your morale just gradually reduces over time. It's a bit up and down, different events during a particular day, can help, etc. But I think there is a longer term trajectory downwards. I think life for Daw Suu now must be incredibly difficult. She has a number of underlying health conditions that she has to deal with. The conditions that she's being held under are quite awful, and it's my understanding that her conditions have not really improved that much. So, the physical surroundings in which she lives are not very conducive at all. She's 79 years old. I mentioned the health conditions. I think all those strengths and so on are with her still, and so she'll be getting through it. But I think they're the sort of conditions, the sort of situation that most people would buckle under quite quickly. So, I worry about her. I think all of those people who know and love her worry terribly about her.
Well, she is a political prisoner on trumped-up charges, imprisoned by a military regime in what seem to be very harsh circumstances in Naypyidaw at the moment. And we might disagree with things that she has said and done, but she has been the strongest force for democracy in Burma, Myanmar, in a generation. And she is imprisoned because she was that force for democracy.
Aung San Suu Kyi's fall was complete. The generals locking her away in confinement, the outside world barely registering her absence, the junta unfettered.
It's also estimated that more than 2,600 people have been killed in the military's crackdown on dissent so far.
Since last year's coup, the junta has deployed attack helicopters and fighter jets against armed rebels opposing its rule.
Was her downfall a trap set by the military? Or was she the architect of her own political disgrace?
Now that people no longer regard my mother as the icon they once did, there's no longer the light shining on Burma, so the military are able to get away with a lot more than they could in the past.
It's hard to put into words how awful it is. Every day, people are arrested. Every day, fighter jets bomb schools, houses, monasteries. People cannot express themselves. People cannot protest. There are 20,000 people behind bars, 20,000 people. Myanmar has brought back the death penalty. They've executed 4 people. Something like 12 million school children have no access to education. The healthcare system, other systems have almost completely collapsed.
After the military staged the coup, the Burmese populace basically came out in peaceful protests and were met with a complete brutal crackdown. You know, the military shot people in the streets, and eventually the people realised that peaceful protest wasn't going to go anywhere at this point. So the country has been in full-on civil war for the last 3 years, and the people have been, woefully ill-equipped and receiving no help from external sources, whilst the military have had fighter jets and all sorts of other weaponry to train against their own people, and they're quite willing to do so.
Failed state, I mean, we can throw around that word, but there's a civil war, there's a full-blown civil war going on in several parts of the country. It's, as I said before, it's a nightmare. And I mean, I think maybe that part has been forgotten of how bad it is and how bad it is getting. And I'm not exaggerating that there's someone arrested, killed, or someone who has to flee, abducted, beaten, tortured, almost every day in Myanmar today. This is not, it's no exaggeration.
There were something like 20,000 political prisoners in jail, as well as Aung San Suu Kyi, and we should remember them as well as her. But on the other hand, there are also increasing reports that the military itself is under the most pressure it's been since the coup.
The KNLA won't give us the exact numbers on the size of their fighting force. They want to keep the military junta in the dark, but they will say that their army has more than doubled since the start of this conflict, and they are training more all the time.
There are signs here and there of the military actually losing ground, losing up to 15,000 defections from the army, something which never happened in the past. So it's clear that although the situation is extremely bleak, it's not ended, and there is the conceivable possibility that Suu Kyi might actually come out of there and still recognised by the vast majority of her people as their legitimate elected leader.
But the conditions under which she's been held in insane and wherever she is now have been very punishing, I think. And she's aging, as we all are. She will, at some point, disappear from the scene. Is that the end of the NLD? No, I don't think it is. The NLD will transform into something else. You can't get rid of the idea.
Maybe it does feel sometimes like Myanmar has been forgotten, and I guess that the answer to that, and or at least what Amnesty says, is accountability. So what we can't forget is the people who are responsible for this crisis. The person who is in charge now, Min Aung Hlaing, was the same person in charge during the Rohingya crisis. Nothing's happened to him, or other than sort of global condemnation, calls for investigations. But you can't allow someone to trample on human rights and then sort of be surprised when they do it all over again.
You won't do it through a military dictatorship. You can keep these things suppressed for a while, but they will regress, they will come back. And the end result is just, you know, endless suffering for people, and the destruction of people's aspirations, both personal and political. And I think that's a great tragedy.
A woman the world rejected. The treatment of Suu Kyi had seen her cause barely register with those outside of Myanmar. Is this alien fighter for democracy now a victim of cancel culture? Or does she deserve her fall from grace?
I think she has been cancelled, and she was cancelled before that term, cancel and cancel culture became what it is now, something one hears every day.
I think her ardent supporters are her ardent supporters, and not much has changed. And it's undeniable she still has a lot of support, and she's still revered by many Myanmar people. But I think it's really like, just to go back to the Rohingya again, I mean, they were her supporters as well. And so it's really those people that she let down.
Her journey is a complicated one, and I would say that we should neither demonize nor idolize her. She is, on balance, a truly courageous, remarkable person who fought with extraordinary persistence and determination for her country's democracy. On the one hand, she's criticized very understandably for not speaking up for human rights, not defending those minorities, not trying to prevent a genocide. But on the other hand, she was trying to deal with a military, and she had really no power to actually stop what was happening.
I think it's possible to be critical of that, but also say we should be campaigning for her release. She is not a non-person, you know? And we might suspend judgment on our view of her in history. But nevertheless, you know, this is a person utterly unjustly treated by a military dictatorship. And so we should not forget her.
I think she's still a great figure because I think that to her people, and just now we're seeing people being crushed. We saw many people, those young people who took to the streets and who demonstrated and who were mown down. Many killed, many thrown in prison. I mean, what has been happening, and we don't get enough news of this from Myanmar, is shocking. And there's no doubt that for the people who took to the streets against the takeover, the coup by the military, they believe in her still. I still see her as being a vitally important figure in the business of building democracy in very difficult places. And I think that, like all of us, she's flawed, but by God, her strength of character, in many ways, is the thing that she'll be known for, and that we should relish in her.
She always thought of herself as a politician, negotiating difficult issues and trying to find difficult compromises. I mean, she did this, some of it well, some of it not so well. But that's the nature of politics. And I think a lot of people outside seem to have fallen for the view that she was indeed a secular saint, and therefore she deserved this sort of condemnation for failing to meet the exalted standards that they had set for her without actually thinking about whether any of these standards were real or achievable. And I think that's, for me, the biggest betrayal.
Meanwhile, her country suffers under the most brutal regime. To many, she is the last flame of hope, albeit barely flickering, with the junta wanting her snuffed out.
Well, her legacy remains to be seen. This is a continuing story. There are twists and turns all the way.
For her to be set free, I think the revolution needs to be won, basically.
If you had a message to the military today, if they were listening, if they were watching, what would you say?
To hand power back to the people, to step down and to stop brutalising their own people. I've lived with this for so many years. You learn to keep on hoping, and eventually things do change. Change is inevitable one way or another. I just hope it's sooner rather than later.